All my life, grinding all my life, sacrifice, hustle, pay the price, want a slice, got to roll the dice, that's why, all my life, I've been grinding all my life, grinding all my life, sacrifice, hustle, pay the price, want a slice, got to roll the dice, that's why, all my life, I've been grinding all my life.
All right, well, it's about 9 a.m. Welcome to the Eon Expert Webinar Series. We're broadcasting live from the Mark Cuban Company's home office in Dallas, Texas. We have a terrific panel here today. We're going to introduce everybody in just a minute. I'm Christine Spraker, co-CEO of Eon. Sitting next to me is the founder of Eon, co-CEO as well, Alzubaidi. Aki, you're an interventional pulmonologist. You really founded Eon just to solve your own clinical problem as a result of inadequacies in healthcare technology.
Yeah, that's right. I was, these two guys here came out in 2013 with the ACCP guidelines for managing incidental pulmonary nodules. And that's just an abnormality where a patient who was looking for, they may have been looking for something else, like a blood clot in their lung. They found a pulmonary nodule, and that could be cancer. And so I wanted to just follow their directions, honestly. And in 2014, I went down to my radiology department and I said, send me every single incidental nodule so I could manage them per guidelines. And that was impossible. So I tried to fix this problem with my EHR, with Excel spreadsheets, with hanging file folders. And then I went out into the market and tried to see if there was a solution, and there wasn't. And so I met up with Christine, found out that this was a broad problem, and really just said, why not me? And decided to try to solve this problem on our own.
So glad you did. Do you want to introduce everybody?
Absolutely. So to my left is Mark Cuban. I started, in terms of leaders in digital technology, I always knew that you were going to be the guy that would help out healthcare and bridging the gap between what technology could actually do and what was actually implemented in healthcare. So I emailed you at all of your portfolio companies by looking at the email structure, and you finally wrote me back on June 25th of 2014 and said, it was 2014, man.
5 years ago.
5 years ago. You said, wish I could help. Can't you find a local software developer you trust? And then you went ghost. But throughout the years, kept giving you updates and just honestly, thank you so much for investing in the company. Thank you for your response.
Well, you could give them the payoff. You just left it at ghost.
That's right. That's right. No, you were in.
Yeah.
You told us what to do. I just wanted to tell you, man, I've been waiting a long time to say thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Gerard Silvestri, the president of the ex-president of CHEST and scientist, excellent physician. I started emailing Gerard. I like math. And so predictive modeling, back in 2014, 2015, I had sent you some work. I email a lot of people, as you know. So Gerard was somebody that I emailed, and he wrote me back and said, I have this goal, and that goal is to know if a pulmonary nodule is cancer or if it isn't cancer. And thankfully, you decided to work with us, responded to me when you didn't have to. You've been a huge influence in my life, and I wanted to thank you too, and thank you for being here, Gerard. Yeah. Peter Mazzone, at the Cleveland Clinic, is responsible for creating evidence-based guidelines. Just a wonderful human being. You've been excellent to me, and you as well have a goal, I think, to understand what abnormalities actually are. You've been just the best person, the best doctor to us over the past 4 or 5 years to get us to this point. Thank you so much for being here as well, Peter.
Thanks.
Georgie Eapen from MD Anderson. He's the incoming president of the American Association of Bronchology and Pulmonology, Interventional Pulmonology. I learned yesterday that Georgie is in the Army Reserve and has been deployed, and I just wanted to thank you formally for your service. And then also, I learned a lot about, there's a need for doctors to go into the Army Reserves, and just wanted to give this a real quick time to say that if you're a physician and, just coming out of fellowships, one of the best times to do this, sign up for the Army Reserves. And I just can't believe that you do that with your position and everything that you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. We have a lot to talk about today. We've divided the webinar into two sections. The first, we're really going to talk about the issues in healthcare technology, the cost, the failures of the EMRs, how the IT departments within hospitals are really paralyzed because of the technology, and then finally the misaligned incentives. On the back half, we'll dig into some of the steps we can take to mitigate some of these issues. Sound good? You ready? All right.
You are.
So we all talk about how healthcare is unaffordable, and Mark, you've been really outspoken about the payer system and how it contributes to the cost of healthcare. Another big issue that's contributing to the cost of healthcare is healthcare technology, and it's now 40 to 50% of the annual cost increase. Aggie and I see it all the time where technology from the 1990s is repackaged, repurposed, and then sold to hospitals for hundreds of thousands of dollars, where if you made it today, it would be fractional. So our question to you then is, let me make sure I get it right, how can the providers on the panel, as well as hospitals, know what technology should cost? And then why do you think it's been okay for the industry to overcharge for technology that is now fractional?
That's a loaded question, right? But just to give you a little bit about my background, my first company was a systems integrator that wrote custom software back in the 80s, believe it or not. And so I did work for hospitals and probably overcharged a few back then. And the nature of it hasn't changed. It's hard, right? Because when you're writing software and developing technology, you typically have a goal in mind that you're trying to solve and trying to get all the pieces in place so that not only you're writing the software so it works, but that it integrates to what's already there and works and operates with the people that are going to be using it is hard. And I think we're going through a transitory period right now. In 2014, you didn't really have a lot of conversations about machine learning. You didn't have a lot of conversations about AI because the processing speeds weren't quite there yet. NVIDIA was doing its thing with GPUs, but it was just starting to introduce it into technology, making itself available or being used by technologists that could solve problems using AI. And we saw the early days of machine learning back then. Now we're extending AI into so many different areas, including what Eon's doing. And so what's changing now is IT, the role of IT is changing dramatically. So it's no longer, the role of data is changing IT dramatically. So it's no longer just about writing software, solving a problem, but really creating platforms like Eon that allow you to aggregate data, have the data teach you, have the data become more predictive so that you can be smarter. Where in the past, it was really about, logic driven, if this, then that. And so, that's really what's changed. And so it's difficult for hospitals to evolve because you don't turn over your IT people or the people in charge of IT every 6 months or every 2 years. And even though, the nature of technology is to change, seemingly daily, it's really changed dramatically for the better. And so providers of any sort are going to have to start recognizing that capturing data and being able to understand how to utilize that data is going to drive as much of what you do as the processes that you use to automate using software.
Yeah.
Can I just follow up and ask you a question?
Sure.
So I hear all this, and I hear the AI piece, and I hear machine learning, and I do some of that stuff. My question to you is, take it from the systems level to the individual physician. So that's where we're, I think, struggling. How do you make it so that, like, when I go on my smartphone and order something, it's all there and I don't have to think about it? How do you do that and have me help manage a patient?
So first of all, you stop siloing data. So right now, because of the insurers networks and the way they're designed, the complication comes in administration first. And so when and again, I'm not a physician, I don't deal with it on a daily basis, but my perception of it is that you try to fit whatever you can into the squares and the round holes that are already there. And that's not necessarily optimized for processing. And that's part one. And so that's the administration part. Part two is the decision-making part of it, right? So how are you, people talk about evidence-based medicine. People talk about using your experiences, doctors just leveraging their experiences. And that's really an aggregation of data. And now the third portion of that or basis of that, foundation of that is letting machines calculate something, using the AI, using machine learning. So that provides a third input. So there's two discrete parts. So when you talk about ordering, it's an administration function. And that's an IT-driven issue. But in terms of implementing care, that's a data-driven aspect of it. And I think they're separate, if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think so.
Or if not, tell me.
I think it does. My only problem is getting these two people together, these two
and
together, and then putting it in a format that is, again, most physicians aren't writing software, right? Like they're trying to take care of patients. How do we bridge that gap? Peter and I write a lot of guidelines for the how-to, the evidence-based.
How are we going to solve it?
How do I get my guy? We know that 30, 40, 50% of the time, doctors don't follow the guidelines because it's just not easy enough.
And it's hard, just taking the time to learn the guidelines, let alone implement them, is difficult. I was just having this conversation yesterday with a epistemologist, if I can say that right. And I think we're going to get to a point where, hopefully sooner than later, where you're going to be using a device to capture just your natural language. Right? And then there'll be natural language processing that'll parse all those things and distribute it and disperse it into the features that you're looking for. So if you're treating a patient and you're just talking naturally, recording what you say to the patient, and obviously you can blank out the patient's name and there's a lot of privacy things that you have to take care of, then that becomes kind of your play-by-play, to use a basketball analogy, of everything that you've done on a step-by-step basis. Then if you take AI, natural language processing, and take your guidelines and apply it to just what was said, then all that information not only becomes your personal experience that gains the patient benefits from, but also becomes input to all the data sources that need to happen. In the past, as a programmer, what we would do is we'd say, okay, we're creating a database, and each database has records, and each record has fields in it, and then based off of what you tell me, and 5 different physicians will tell you 5 different things that they need for their practice, but based off of what you tell me, then we'll create an application that accommodates those things. What's changing is, rather than being database driven like it traditionally has been, here's what you told me you needed, here's what you're telling me now, I'm going to give you output based off of what you told me. There'll be a lot more AI driven, natural language processing driven, where you'll be able to take anything that's said by 10 different doctors, even accounting for regional differences, specialty differences, and translate those into data that can then fill in. So while you're talking and you're saying, I need to order X, Y, and Z, it'll process that and recognize the word order and record whatever word you trained it to use, or words, and then respond accordingly.
But more
almost like Alexa, right? So, right, Alexa, tell me this or that.
But we're so far off. What's happening now is that marketing departments are selling AI, right? And so what they're selling, these guys, we all deal with pulmonary knowledge. So there's software that can do, it's called segmentation, where you take a CT scan and they can reconstruct a pulmonary nodule. They're calling it AI. It was built in 1990, straight up, right? And now it's open source, and I could probably build the whole thing, for less than 10 grand. And then, it's $100. They're selling it for $150K. Like, what you're talking about isn't there yet. How do we educate doctors, physicians, providers, hospitals to not buy, the shit from 1990?
Well, it's outcomes, right? It's purely outcomes, right? Because if the shit from 1990 in the 1990s, it's not going to give you the outcomes that you're hoping for. And the beauty of data is that you're tracking outcomes, and that's what you guys are doing too, right? Because you're able to be predictive, right? You're able to be proactive, and that's a big difference from the old school programming that was done in the 90s by guys like me. That is all logic based, this, then that, and that's the difference. That's what differentiates. Logic based is what's completely different than logic based program is completely different than what AI and its derivatives are doing.
I have a question
Sure.
regarding that. You talk about outcomes, and I agree with you. I think it all comes down to outcomes.
Of course.
But how, as individuals, when all these platforms come in promising, there's a hope that you're going to do this platform's going to do this platform. And a lot of times when we try it out, it turns out to be hype. And but what we've seen so far, and I'd like to get your thoughts on the solution to this, is if it's difficult for me to use it, and if it's difficult for him to use it, but it's easy for him to use it, how does that get aggregated up so that the ones that are value added for the greatest number of people gets to
You know,
top.
that's the question of all medicine, right? Right. This drug versus that, you know, the outcomes versus not, the testing that's involved.
Right.
And a lot of that comes down to the resources you have to test, right? And in some cases, you're winging it, right? Which vendor do you trust over? You trust Aki and Christine and get the right outcomes, and that builds trust, and that trust extends into other locations. And, you know, that's the reality of software today. And then, you know, in doing your research, right, it's, you know, when you read research on specific medical problems, you look at the peer review in a lot of respects. You know, because if a vendor writes something, you question it, right? Just inherent.
Right.
Software's the same thing, right? If a vendor's writing something, I always question because no vendor's going to call themselves an idiot, right? But if you ask for references, and then go out and research those references to see what the outcomes are, then you're going to know. Now the challenge is your time constraint. Right. The second challenge is the nature of doctors is to find all the information themselves. Right. So you're always looking for shortcomings to try to figure it out yourself. I used to hate to write software for doctors. Hated it because they knew more than I did, and they would tell you, you know. And so that's part of the challenge. But again, I think in the decision making now, you want to look for platforms that you know will evolve. And when they're old school software, new, you know, software written in old school ways where it's logic driven, then you know you're going to have challenges because you always have to update the software with the program. The nature of AI isn't so much that you're changing, it changes because libraries and research change things, it's lottery ticket, you know, for neural net, whatever. But at the same time, it's data driven, right? You want systems where the data makes the system smarter as opposed to programmers being required to alter the system to make it smarter. That's how you tell the difference between a system that's going to be a foundation for your future versus not.
So that's a great segue, so we can move into EMRs. And so part of the problem with traditional EHRs is all the data is siloed. You're talking about AI and data, and we're assuming that it's all easy to access, right? The problem is that it's not currently. It's held hostage in these silos just across every hospital system, and you have the same EHR as another hospital, but they still can't talk to each other, right? So that's a lot of what you guys are experiencing. The technology's there, the NLP's there. We can do all of that today. It's integrating it into the workflow.
Well, but part of the challenge is insurance companies, right? Everything is driven by a different contract, and every year the contract changes. You know, whether it's for employer-based or ACA or Medicare, maybe Medicare and Medicaid, the contracts don't change nearly as often. But that's part of what you need to talk to your representatives about. You know, that's, you know, when I work with HHS, you know, with their Blue Button program, that's a big part of what they're trying to do is minimize the number of contracts every year. If you're in an environment where you have to renegotiate your contracts every year to determine your networks and determine how everything works, you're already against the 8 ball because you're siloing to the insurance companies. Then you have to fight to get it back. You know, I'm just not a big fan of how the insurance companies are dealing with those issues right now.
And you've been really outspoken about that. What about the hospitals that have, you know, invested $1 billion into a medical record system that's failing them?
I mean, shit happens. you know, look, I've got friends that are CEOs of big hospital systems, and look, if you go back through the history of technology and healthcare, there's always inflection points, and during those inflection points, or at those inflection points, there's disruption and there's difficulty. You know, we went from everything being, one of my first jobs out of college, or as an internship more than anything, was converting banks from physical systems to digital systems. And it was disruption. And hospitals went through the same thing. How do you go from physical, you know, paper-driven systems to digital? And then how do you, you know, integrate networks? That was a big deal. You know, that's what my company did, hooking PCs together so now PCs can talk, and that was a big deal. Then you got to the cloud, and that was a big deal. And so this is an inflection point right now where data is your best ally. And part of the transition isn't just about getting rid of old software systems, but designing new systems and enabling systems that don't silo data, right, but can create data that can be used elsewhere. And that's part of where you've got to be aware.
Let me ask a question regarding that. I think you put this very well. I mean, it's very well articulated. You know, part of what I see with the medical record, or the electronic medical record, is it means different things to different people. It could be a record, so it could be a record of things that have been done. You're describing a very broader picture of what it could be used to learn for the future and improve things. How when we set up designing these platforms, a lot of times these platforms are designed for, like we talked about the banks. Well, they're designed, all their software is designed around making them money. So they have a mission. They understand what that mission is, and everything drives towards that. For us, with the medical record, some of it is set up for billing purposes, which is what you talked about, the insurance things. Some of it is set up so that we can communicate with each other and with our patients and we can record. And then some of it is set up to learn, but very minute. How do you see this overarching mission as to what the medical record ought to be? How do we agree on that?
That's what's changing, right? So it goes back to what I was saying. Traditionally with EMRs, they're database driven and they're for the most part relational database driven. It's an old school programming. I'm a little bit out of date on some of my technology there, but it's like I was saying earlier, someone designs it, you write software that reflects that design, and then you try to keep it updated as new things come up, right? That's what's become outdated. And so for right now, in this day and age, it's hard because you're running into that conflict of the only data you really have access to is the way the program was designed with the logic that's behind it. And so they've tried to integrate it and extend it into as many places as they can. So you've got the foundation of patient information, which then drives codes, which just then drives billing. And then the billing doesn't really need to be shared outside the payer, but the patient information, there's ways to send it to a cloud so that other people can retrieve it. And then those other people, because, our bodies are basically one big math equation, right? And there's X number of variables that we've been able to identify. But once it gets to another doctor, there may be a whole nother variable, there may be a whole nother element that's important in that circumstance that wasn't covered or wasn't even considered, right? So anticipating nodules is different than a database-driven environment where identifying, recording what's already been identified. And that's what's changing, right? And so that's why companies like Eon are starting to really take off, because they're going from logic-driven to data-driven. And logic-driven meaning predefined with huge IT departments dealing with change requests from doctors and administrators to, okay, now we're in an environment where the data drives everything. So if I introduce new data, immunotherapies, right? If you have a system that was designed 7 years ago, you didn't incorporate immunotherapies in any type of your considerations at all, right? The new system, the more we get into, we get into CRISPRs, there's an altered gene and that just decided, or here's your genomes that this patient brought in from 23andMe and it says they had this gene that's, that we're going to take a look because you're more likely to have X, Y, or Z. Well, now you start getting into data-driven systems where the data is the repository, and it can grow, and it's kind of like it takes on a form of its own, and then you layer on top of it extractions from that data. The data drives everything, and that's why when you talk about AI, they call them neural networks because it reflects how we approach problem solving and thinking. Now we're still only at the stage of maybe a 2-year-old, if we're lucky, in terms of logic. But that 2-year-old knows not to put their hand on the fire if you're on something hot a second time. That's what's changing. So the challenge is you're going from an era where there's incumbent businesses who are trying to, Aki's point, to tell you, we got this covered, right? And we're just going to we're going to extract data from the database, and they can to a certain respect. If you extract all the data that you have and position it in a way that you have open access to it, okay, export, put it up in the cloud, let some logic deal with extracting the data and then putting that into a new format, and then letting your AI deal with extracting what's important and tell you what you're missing. Okay, but you need a company that is built that way and thinks that way, and that's the challenge. So, it's not the best news, and if we were having this conversation 5 years ago, I wouldn't be able to say the exact same things, and that's what's changed. And so what comes next, the real foundation of why we can have this conversation is processor speeds are going like this. We're on that hockey stick of processor speeds, so that and the ability to not only take one processor but a variety of GPUs and connect them together to do things that 5, 7, 10 years ago would have taken 500 hours or 5,000 hours to do in 50 minutes. That's what's changed. And now if you look at the number, there's a site called Archive, I don't know, it's like Roman numerals, right? ARXIV, something like that. There used to be 100 papers a month about AI. Now there's thousands. There used to be, okay, now you just aggregate all big data, and now they're talking about how do you create predictions with less data, right? How do you build a neural network with less processing speed so that your IT department can deal with it? And that's why data scientists are becoming so important. That's why labeling data is far more important. I mean, one of the biggest jobs in healthcare, is going to be labeling data. This is a water receptacle, right? This holds water, so does this, and being able to recognize different data types and be able to recognize what something is. Now that they've got something called generative adversarial networks that allow you to take the output of one neural network and look and have it processed by another and tell you what it's seeing. Is it a cow or a cat? There's just so much that's advancing so quickly right now that it's almost like the old days when I was programming, where there'd be new programming languages, but there'd be processing speeds that were faster, and there'd be faster and larger hard drives. So when I first started programming, a 20 megabyte hard drive from IBM for a 6 megahertz processor, that IBM PC cost $5,000. You guys remember those days, right? And that's what you dealt with, and that was a huge step forward. I remember having to go get trained for Lotus 123 so I could sell a spreadsheet for $500. That was a great step forward because you could say, what if? What if I did it this way? Now, the difference is when you have you can source almost unlimited amounts of data, for better or worse, and what AI will do for you is examine for patterns in an unlimited amount of data, where in the past, a physician, a doctor, a surgeon, whatever it may be, had the benefit of their experience and the people around them to look to identify things. That opens the door in an untold, in factorial number of options, and that's what's changing dramatically now.
So I don't disagree with you, but let's talk about the data. First of all, in these EHRs, let's just take Epic, for example. They have 500 different implementations where there's variations on all the data. So I agree with you about the need for translation, right? A cup has to be a cup. We've all kind of gone through this, especially with the Watch the Spot trial, where there's a data code book, and then across 26 different sites, the variations in what those data fields are labeled and how they're labeled and what they actually mean needs to be translated to get good insights. Now, Peter, you and I tried to do a computer vision product, a computer vision experiment, and what we found was, and I don't know if you remember, Google had a Kaggle $1 million lung nodule contest, right? And so we used the same data that was used by the Kaggle data scientists, and then also worked with Peter. And what we found is that one, there's so much variability in ground truth, right? And the
in terms of the labels themselves, or
if it's labeled.
Even if it's labeled,
that's the challenge, right?
And they live in these different places where to get true clinical value from AI, right? The number of ground truths and curated data has been grossly underestimated, right? So it's kind of like we need to create an alliance among foes to try to actually get to the point where AI actually brings clinical value.
That's a different issue. So what you're talking about is domain expertise, right? And so, because if you don't agree on what something is, what you call your ground truth, right, then it doesn't matter.
No, what I'm saying is that there's just not even, we can agree on ground truths, but right now the data sets that we have are like you said.
So the example of ground truth, is it cancer, is it not cancer?
Right.
And
that's domain expertise, right?
But right now the radiologist will say, it looks like it could be cancerous, and then they were using that as the label, as the ground truth in the Kaggle study.
Right, but that's domain expertise, right, versus CYA, right? So it's,
I think what's exciting though is what you just said, and how do we get clinical benefit from AI or these other technologies? It felt 10 years ago like technology would show up to solve a problem that really didn't impact us, whether it was billing or whatever it might be. It was necessary, but it didn't help, and it may have hurt us in some way.
Yeah.
But now, I feel like we're more at the table. We're able to say, what do we really need? And we hear how people with expertise in producing these solutions can help us. When the solution is made without really the clinical knowledge, it's going to fail us. Do you see that
Oh
happening?
yeah, it's
more as well?
just what they were talking about, right? And what I was calling domain expertise. So if a radiologist looks at an MRI, whatever it may be, right, on the and says, I'm not sure, right? Well, then the physician, whoever is responsible, has to go through and look at all the other data, and then you take your best guess, right? And so when you label data, that becomes part of what feeds into your, in this case, machine learning, right? Where you want somebody, so where I think it's going to answer your question is, you're going to have radiologists who are able to identify nodules, go in and spend, your resident radiologist will go in and spend a lot of time labeling, right? So, and going through and verifying the veracity of the data sets that you have, so it feeds, in a way that solves the problem that you're referring to.
Yeah, so there's labeling is one problem, but then the second problem is commercial interest. And so the hospitals, well,
that's the battle, like that you and I talk about all the time,
yeah.
right? How do you overcome the incumbency, right? Because when somebody puts their butt on the line, right, and says, I think this is the right solution, they're not all going to turn around and say, yeah, I was wrong, right? But that's where you get forward-thinking folks, right, who are willing to bring you guys in and say, you know what, we recognize that it requires for, lung nodules is a specific domain expertise that when it comes to AI, machine learning, however you're approaching it, that you need somebody who recognizes it. And fortunately, even with the incumbent systems, they're not mutually exclusive, right? As long as you can source the data for what you need, you could do it, next, side by side. And that's the good news. That's why I invested, right? Because it can be done side by side and you can demonstrate results. It doesn't mean the big guys, and we have this conversation, aren't going to try to squash you. That's their job, right? But what did Tom Peters, Clayton Christensen, that's the innovator's dilemma, where it's just going to be people want to keep selling what they've been selling, and that's always going to be a challenge. But that's the challenge of every startup. When you run with the elephants, there's the quick and the dead, right? And that's why you guys are quick, and you're once you can apply that domain expertise, and like we've talked, extending it beyond just lung nodules, because now you're able to take that same approach. And so data is the new oil. And when you have domain expertise and work with the smart people who have domain expertise, and you can start to define data sets and then start expanding those data sets, then there is a point of diminishing returns, but your systems get smarter. That is the direct opposite of the traditional legacy systems, where they give you databases of what you've done, but they don't really get smarter. They can make you a little smarter by telling you what's already happened, so your knowledge improves, but the systems themselves don't make you smarter. And I think that's what you asked me.
Can I just jump in?
Sure.
So they sent, you might not know this, but they sent like your whole background. So I knew when you were selling paper out. and the thing that like sort of I got to, and you just articulated, but I need to ask you this question. So we are in these purchasing rooms. So we go in and we have to beg, if you will. They have a certain amount for this year's technology. You go in, you can bring an Aki or not. You can tell them this is the need, and they're looking for the return on their investment, et cetera. But the thing that is impressing me so much that I need to ask you how you got through, because I think it'll help all physicians, which is this. There seems to us to be a generational difference when it comes to technology, right? So people are scared to take a chance. People, like I'm sitting here talking to you, you could sell me anything right now and I'd buy it. But the truth of the matter is that I can't do that when I'm in a technology space.
Right.
And there seems to be this generational difference. And but you've had it in your businesses coming through. They've been newer businesses where people buy. It actually extends to the research arm of this, because for example, when we write grants, Peter and I have written grants around AI, and we've had reviewers of those grants at national levels say, we just don't really know. Like, you have to show us the stepwise approach. You're not able to tell us why this works even, right? Like, because the machine's teaching itself. So how do you get through that generational gap where they're just protecting their
tutorials. I mean, how did I learn, right? I mean, look, I'm 60 years old, right? I mean, I'm old, not old, but
New 40.
It's 40, yeah, the new 40, the new 30, I tell my wife, my kids. But I sat there because I had to learn this. I'm going to be a real geek. I got to be able to geek out, right? And so it's true. I've got to be able to talk to them. I've got another healthcare genesthesis that takes the output of, every heart has, every organ in your body emits an electrical pulse, right? And there's sensors that capture that. And they do for cardiac stuff, they're able to tell you within 30 minutes if it's one of 5 different cardiac diseases with 97% accuracy. Well, how do I know to invest in them and these guys? Tutorials. I literally go on Amazon and I do the machine learning tutorials, and it's really straightforward. I go in how to build a neural network with JavaScript or with Python. I take my Python tutorial. The thing about technology that I've told myself, tell my kids, tell everybody I work with, there's the person or people who invented it and created it, and then there's everybody else. You're tied for second place the day it's released. And I can keep up with everybody else if I just put in the time. Now, I'm not a doctor. I don't have to deal with all the medical stuff and all that. But, you just put in the time. And so when it comes down to now being able to explain it, because I've had a history of all that technology, I'm able to kind of give it context. But you're right, but even kids, right? If you talk to Gen Z, millennials, they don't know this stuff either because it's still within the last 5-7 years. We literally, here in one of the other offices, have taught classes to underprivileged high school kids on machine learning. How you can use a spreadsheet and what machine learning is, because AI is going to change everything. They're telling those kids that, not to get off too much of a tangent, they're telling these kids that if you're a coder, you're going to be okay. 15 years,
maybe not.
Math is math, right? The system's going to do the math, and programming is just math. And it's just logic-driven math, and that's going to be done by systems. Here's what I want, and I'll just say it. The NLP will parse it, and they'll convert it to logic, and boom, you're out of a job. And so, understanding it is a process, but it's actually, it's like every other tech I've had to learn. It's not that complicated once you spend some time with it. Machine learning is like a big spreadsheet that just fills in some blanks. I've got 10,000 records that tell me here are the 5 features of a plant. Well, I've got 900 records where I'm missing one feature. What kind of plant is it? Tell me what kind of plant it is. That's machine learning. That's all it is.
I have a question, if you don't mind, and it goes back to what you talked about, data. I'd like to hear your thoughts as to who owns the data. So patient level information clearly, to me, this is my opinion, belongs to the patient. Of course, right? It's my name, it's my data.
My data, it's my baby.
It's me. So I'll be able to take it wherever I go, right? The predictive analytics, the billing component is probably belongs to whoever's doing the billing. But the predictive analytics, whatever platform somebody has created this neural network and has learned all these things, that has used this data to learn that. What are your thoughts regarding that, and how do you prevent the natural sort of siloing that happens when you're looking at a proprietary formula of some kind?
Well, the data, an individual's data isn't of much use to a bigger picture, right? So you can anonymize it, that's fine. But yeah, so if you feel like your privacy is being violated, you can extract it and you can take it. But A, the patient should own all the data. B, that becomes very, very valuable. I've gotten to big arguments. I'm a big believer that you set your own personal benchmarks through testing. And so I want to own all my own personal data. But when it comes to training data, it can be anonymized. It doesn't matter if it's Aki, George, whoever, right, Mark. So that part really is safe. Now, where it starts to get finicky is when you walk into a hospital and they're using facial recognition that's so advanced that it knows to compare the skin tone of your face to the last time you were there, and it says, oh, this person might have a fever. Somebody go walk up and talk to them, and oh, by the way, they weren't a patient. They're the aunt or uncle of the person who's bringing in a patient. Then we start crossing lines that are going to be more difficult, and I think that'll happen in hospitals from a security perspective, a proactive analytics perspective, because you want to know if there's a 78% chance that the person that you don't even know who they are, because they're bringing in a patient, there's a 78% chance that they have a fever. and it might spread. So that's where it starts to get thinky.
Do you guys think that patients on data? I'm sorry.
The other question that goes along with that is what is the value of that data? You know, health systems are working on small margins now and looking to say how much value is there to this well annotated data set. What should I be asking for?
So I'll give you the perfect example. So with this company, Genesee, and it's kind of like what Eon's doing in some respects. So I gave you the example where they can use a sensor to determine 1 of 5 cardiac conditions, right? Well, guys our age, right? You feel something in your chest and you freak out. The big one, right? And you don't know what it is until you start to get comfortable with whatever discomfort you have. So what steps do we take? Get an EKG, get an ECG, get the sonogram thingamajiggy, right? You do a nuclear test. You do all these different things not to find out what you have, but to exclude what you have. Maybe you have AFib and it's easy to tell, right? Well, with this, 30 minutes, and you don't have to do all those different tests. And it's because they were able to train with 10,000 examples to know that when you put somebody in a sensor that extracts an audio file, essentially, of the electromagnetic field that's being recorded, you're going to know with 94 to 97% accuracy which of those things, what are the cardiac conditions. So you don't have to take those 20 tests or 5 tests, right? You don't have to sit in the hospital. That's where you start to get the value of it. And so it's like Eon, right? You get to be predictive, right? And we need to go back and check with this person.
I guess what I'm asking is those 10,000 examples, what was the value of those examples? Should a hospital system be charging a lot to partner with a developer of a tool such as you're describing?
Great question.
To have
great question.
data?
The value comes, data gets its value from using AI, whether it's machine learning or neural networks. And machine learning is more linear. Is it this or that? And neural networks is non-linear, so it can tell you, be more predictive or generate things that you didn't think of. That's the way I define it anyways. And so it's not that hospitals need to go out there and recreate the wheel. They don't, simply because, and Aki mentioned this earlier, there's a lot of off-the-shelf database, or libraries rather, that do all this basic blocking and tackling. And it's really, if I'm trying to use machine learning to determine something, if something's a flower or not a flower, a cat or a dog, or if you follow Silicon Valley, hot dog or non-hot dog, right? Right. That is all the same libraries. And so nodule, cancerous or non-cancerous. As long as you have enough training data that gives you the probability levels that you feel confident in. So you don't that's the beauty of what's happening with AI. You don't have to do everything from scratch. You can use the existing libraries to go out there and tell you. And it's the same with neural networks. And it's just amazing how open it is. And the biggest companies that are from Facebook to Google to, not as much Netflix, but maybe some Amazon, they're publishing this and open sourcing all this because they want it to advance more quickly. And so you can take a kid, like for the Mavericks here, we're trying to be able to look at an NBA game video and extract as much data as possible. And we're hiring kids right out of college with data scientists, data backgrounds in Python, basic programming backgrounds, and trying to find new ways to extract this data and create data that we can apply our domain expertise to. And we're using off-the-shelf libraries. And so data, whatever data you can aggregate, it's going to get its value not from just one rocket scientist person that can only figure it out and you got to go hire it, but from 90% of the value is going to come from off-the-shelf libraries, and the 10% is going to be the competitive domain knowledge that is why Google for their, or Uber or Lyft for their autonomous cars go out there and hire super expensive $1 million plus, data AI experts to be able to give you something that they can't get elsewhere.
But Peter, were you asking, should the hospitals, because they have, some things aren't off the shelf. So if Peter has a curated database of 1,000 nodules at Cleveland Clinic, should the hospitals, if they were to partner with someone like Aki, should the healthcare systems who have now this aggregated data be in the business of partnering, and should they be charging, and you know what I mean? It's like what you were kind of getting at.
Okay, sorry. So to answer your question, Dan, you're going to have, if you've got 1,000, you're going to have to be in the business of not necessarily programming per se, but you want to have a data scientist on staff that's good, that Peter, you're going to be able to go to and say, I've got this data, what can we do with it? And then you're going to need somebody who knows and understands the technology to be able to say our best response and our best results are going to come from this vendor or these alternatives. It's almost like I have to, as an investor, I get pitched AI every minute of every day, right? This deal, this deal. And I can ask 5 questions and know if they're full of crap or not, right? Because everybody talks that they have AI, when in reality, 99% of them are just using off-the-shelf libraries and are just integrating. And so maybe to answer your question, having somebody who is a data scientist that takes responsibility for capturing all the data and making sure you retain that data, looking for upside by partnering, so each of you can partner, partnering with vendors to, on a cost-benefit analysis, build versus buy, and then making the choice. Right. More often than not, I think in this early stage, you're better off using vendors. Now that's, self-interest in a lot of respect, but we're still so early that you just have to have somebody who understands AI and understands the value of data so you can capture. And you'll find that, between a few hospitals in a system, over a period of years, you're going to have all the data you need. It's just a matter of how do you use it and what can you learn from it.
I think my fear is that the hospitals value the data at too high a level to foster partnership with.
Yeah, and why that won't work. Why that won't work. Well, I guess I can't say it for certain, but unfortunately, the reality is there's going to be people with lung cancer all around the world, right? And if the data comes from Kazakhstan, it's just as good as the data coming from Cleveland, right? That's just the reality. And so that equilibrium is already in place. And so do you pay for it? There will be companies, there are companies that are popping up that are saying, you know what, I'm going to go out and find as many MRIs as I can and label what's in them, and then I'm going to sell that data to people who may not have captured it. And hopefully your hospitals are saying, we're capturing ourselves. Maybe we need a little bit of that data to get us to the next level, or Aki will buy that data so he doesn't have to go through the labeling process. But that's just a build versus buy like any other decision.
But so universities have CTOs, technology transfer offices, where there's some, so usually basic science. Yeah. So that an investigator like me, I'm not a basic scientist, but I'm a health services researcher. But like, let's say I worked on a new drug and it got developed through the lab, through NIH funding and everything, and they're selling that. Do you ever envision, for example, that someone like Peter, who's curated a huge database, or Georgie or myself, we've curated this database that says cancer, no cancer, and all these other parameters about the patient, working through a CTO and selling that data and interaction. See, that's not what's happening right now, and hospitals are very protective of that.
But there's not a lot of that. The value of that, it diminishes over time. The longer you wait, the less valuable it is. Unless it's just such a huge database, you don't need anybody else's database for the reasons I mentioned. Now, if you have a specialty and you uniquely acquire and retain data for, people with the heart on the wrong side of their body, right? That's going to be a small volume of people. That's different. Then there's more data if that is applicable to how people are using it. But yeah, data is the new oil, and how you process that data becomes the next big challenge, right? And the fight in terms of AI is bias and the ability to audit it. And so where I think the bigger issue is going to be is hospitals having expertise to say, we need to be able to ascertain whether or not the model you use for your machine learning is accurate or not, or is there bias that diminishes the impact of African Americans or people of color or whatever, versus because if you read some of the research where with facial recognition it misapplied to certain body types or certain skin tones, right? Somebody's got to be able to audit that. You don't want bias in your AI, and so that is going to be the biggest challenge because the rest is basic math.
We could probably talk about data forever.
Yeah, I know.
I have the feeling we could.
It's fun.
There's unique challenges in healthcare for sure when it comes to data. A lot of it's with the contracting and who owns the data and privacy and all of that. Is it okay if we talk about some of the misaligned incentives in healthcare
Sure.
So we're all stakeholders sitting here, right? Everything from industry, providers, insurance companies, the government, pharmacies.
Let's not forget the patient.
And
Yeah,
the patient.
and the patient.
But we all have a financial interest in the business of healthcare. But all of our incentives diverge, right? None of us are coming together and saying, oh, we're the ones who's willing to change. I've worked for large healthcare corporations, and they're very well-intentioned, but at the end of the day, their incentives don't necessarily match up with driving down healthcare costs. So I think what we're trying to figure out is how does industry partner with physicians in a way that we get to some clinical utility that makes sense, and it creates clinical value, but how do physicians remain unbiased after taking money from industry to help provide these services? And is it possible to remain unbiased?
I think we all go into medicine because we want to do good. We want to help people first do no harm. And I think in our field, 99+% of everybody I trust. Right? Nothing big gets accomplished without a team of people who have expertise in different areas. I couldn't build a software program, I couldn't do bench science, but I know what's necessary in clinical practice. And so I want to be able to partner with those folks doing that good work to ultimately help patients. There have been examples where people who help then give that advice to the greater community, and it sours that kind of relationship building. And so now people are very, very careful. So I think ideally these teams are built and safeguards are put in place, so there's not just one person saying something's the right thing to do. But I don't think you're going to achieve all of the grand successes we're talking about without clinicians being involved in guiding scientists and industry.
I've seen the other side. I started this company 4 or 5 years ago, and just even yesterday there was a presentation that had our company up with some other bigger companies, in which we've never paid a physician for any consulting. We just can't figure out how not to make them conflicted or biased. And then there was this comparator where the competitor had all the check marks, and then Eon had 0 check marks in terms of capabilities, which was obviously a lie, right? But to me, there's a saying called "speak the Kool-Aid, but don't drink the Kool-Aid," right? And
I've heard that saying before.
Yeah, well, they're speaking. It's a true thing where people come. We're at this conference. It's the American Thoracic Society, and people are here to learn. And there are some key influencers, Peter, that they speak the Kool-Aid, but they're not truly drinking the Kool-Aid. What's your advice to me, George? I know you have some things to say about this. How do we compete with that and stay above board?
So I mean, I think I think first of all, I agree with you, because clinicians have to be at the table because we're the users. We're part of the user base, right? And therefore, whatever solution that comes up has to fit and has to be driven by our experience of it. The issue with I actually don't like that phrase, "speak the Kool-Aid, don't drink it," because it's very disingenuous for somebody to speak the Kool-Aid if you're not willing to drink the Kool-Aid as well. Because you're getting other people,
your own doctor.
you're making other people drink the Kool-Aid, and you're expressing support for that. So I don't like that phrase. I don't know. I've never heard that phrase before, but it's not a good phrase. And I think when you look at where we are in terms of whose experience becomes important, you ask yourself. We talk about driving down healthcare costs. It's really not driving down healthcare costs. Something costs what it costs. If it provides value, it's either worth it or not worth it. So it's the reason why we're talking about driving down healthcare costs is because we all have the perception that the value we're getting from whatever it is that we're paying for and the amount we're paying for is too much. It's not sustainable. So it doesn't matter. It's increasing that value, and hopefully value isn't anything. it's an equation, right? It is, you know, what you bring divided by cost. You know, I mean, so if the denominator goes up, then the value keeps creeping down. You know, I mean, it's math. And so somehow or the other, when we are talking about all these things, when we drive to the same, you can reduce costs by reducing access. You can reduce costs by rationing. You can reduce costs by a whole bunch of different things. And there is always going to be a component of rationing, which I know we've never liked talking about. But the fact of the matter is, when you have limited resources, and their resources are finite, you want to squeeze as much as you can out of it. But it's not going to be everything to everybody. It just isn't. You can ration either geographically. If you live in a remote area, you're not going to get the MRI scanner because there's none close to you, and you're 80 years old and you can't get into a car to drive there. There's rationing all the time. We have to recognize that. We have to figure out how do we build a system, or how do we participate in building a system that provides, you know, I don't want to use the overused term justice, but these.
So isn't the first step more doctors?
Yes, I mean that is one thing, and the question is, is that always going to be the case? I don't know. There are.
Well, I'll tell you this: we have 2.3 doctors per 1,000, 888,000 doctors in this country, and if you compare that to the Nordic countries, where people like to use them as a primary example of good healthcare, whatever that may be, there's 15% more. And I won't get all political on everything, but Senator Schumer is sponsoring a bill, I think it's 328 or something, that provides more Medicare dollars for more residencies to hospitals. You know, and I'm not a big fan of his, but I'm a big fan of legislation like that, because just and it requires, and part of it is paying off student loans, when being tested student loans for doctors, and if you go into healthcare deserts. So you can start to use some basic math and some common sense, I think, because if we don't have enough doctors, you have to ration, particularly if any of the Medicare for all, for America, whatever passes, because then it gets worse. You know, and then to kind of extend it into overall costs, I agree with you 100% on value. But part of the challenge is the cost of healthcare isn't the cost of healthcare anymore, because of all the extraneous costs that insurance companies introduce. You know, under the ACA, there's medical loss ratio of 15% that they fudge half the way through anyways, by taking, enhancements that they plug through there, and, just the administration costs that they put on you guys, anywhere from 21 to 30+%. So the cost of healthcare isn't the cost of healthcare. And so there's a variety of ways to deal with it. That's not a topic for today, but I think we're complicating things for your organizations by forcing things to insurance companies as the payor. The biggest lie, I will say this, the biggest lie ever told to the American people when it comes to healthcare, that insurance is a metric for determining wellness. The number of people insured, reflects the wellness of the population. And insurance is a financial instrument. It really, you give your money to the insurance companies, or the government gives our tax monies to the insurance companies, and we fight to get it back. So I'll get off my soapbox on that.
I think expanding that more physicians, it might be even more just clinicians.
Right.
There's growth in the advanced practice provider community, and matching those clinicians to where the needs are, and then using technology to bring specialty care to areas where it's not.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in Charleston, South Carolina, and 70% of the counties in the state are rural and underserved. And you talk about having enough physicians. The problem is that the physicians who graduate from medical school, and my son's a second-year medical student, are wanting to practice in Charleston, Columbia, and Greenville, which are the three big cities, right? So what Peter's saying is absolutely true, and we've been using telemedicine to reach some of those places for cancer care. But to get back one thing to this team-based thing and alignment of incentives, it is different than a lot of other businesses. We really have people on completely different ends of the spectrum of alignment in terms of, big insurance has a certain amount, the clinicians do, patients certainly have a different perspective on the alignment. I do agree with you, Peter, having those people at the same table is important. And as it relates to the question about conflict of interest, at the American College of Chest Physicians, we have a professional standards committee that has to vet people who want to be involved in the guidelines and say, no, you can't be involved because you have too close of a relationship with industry or anyone else, so that we can trust. And the thing that comes out of that I heard the head of PSC, the Professional Standards Committee, say is we do the New York Times test. If the physician might turn up in the New York Times for having taken a ton of money from industry, and that pendulum was swung both ways, right? For a long time at universities, you couldn't do anything with industry, anything. And I think people recognize now that, look, like, we need to be working with people with different skill sets and having people at the table. And even research organizations, the PCORI, which is the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, a federally funded institute, wants to have patient stakeholders on these committees reviewing grants. So I think it's moving back a little bit to making sure that all the stakeholders are in the same place. The few stakeholders, interestingly enough, that we haven't had are the insurers. They aren't at the table for many of these meetings, and Peter's held a
That's
meeting.
probably good too.
Well, no, maybe it's not though. Maybe we should have them there to make a better case for what it is we do, and maybe we should have them there for at least to understand what they do and combat it if it has to be combated. But not having them there at all leaves out people who influence all the decisions downstream.
Fair enough.
One last question. We're just about at our time, so and I want to get this one in. So Amazon figured it out. You've told me many, many times, make the customer happy, right? And so in healthcare, the patient isn't the customer in terms of technology purchases, and so the patient experience isn't valued, right? And so why can't healthcare be like Amazon?
Well, it is. I mean,
You think
your
so?
outcomes are a lot more definitive than even Amazon's,
He
right?
doesn't have 1,000 reviews. I mean, I could go in like a paper cup. There's 1,000 reviews on a paper cup, right?
Right. And then for better or worse, right?
Yeah.
You know, whether or not I like a cup, there's a lot less at stake, you know, and that's the difference, and that's the challenge. It doesn't mean, though, that to your point, that patients can't be part of the evaluation process, and they probably should, right? If you got the patients in the room when it came to IT decision making, they probably bring some common sense in ways that, you know, you talk about self-interest. I've always, for decades, I've said, you know, the head of IT always has the greatest amount of self-interest because, you know, they can't ever admit they're wrong, or rarely can they admit they're wrong, because it just, there's so much at stake. And so maybe introducing the patient, you know, I don't know how to solve the problem, but, you know, but it goes back to outcomes, right? If you know, if you guys are demanding you need Eon because you want the ability to know when you need to contact this patient next and what's going to put the patient in the best position to get healthy again, that's as strong a demand as I think anybody can make. And I think that's kind of the Amazon. We went back to Amazon 20 years ago when they first started because it was cheaper and easier, you know, and what Bezos always says is your margin is my opportunity. And effectively that's the same with hospitals too, because when a big IT company or big software company is charging millions of dollars or whatever it may be and has huge margins, that's your red flag. Because, you know, everybody else works on minuscule margins. And I really think that probably is the same from Amazon that probably fits the best. Your margin, talking to the software companies, is my opportunity. And we're out there to get it. And you'll know if you're getting it by the implementations and the outcomes.
One of the differences between Amazon, which I get the analogy, and I appreciate all of the things they do that are incredible, right? Is if you don't like that cup, you can send it back.
Right. Yeah.
If you have an illness that might if you have an illness that can cause a life or death situation, it's very personal for the family members going through it, and that's where I think the breakdown in the analogy occurs, and why so many people have a difficult time solving the healthcare issue.
So thank you guys so much. We have one last little surprise. Reese, we went out to Lynchburg, Tennessee to Jack Daniels, and we said we had a goal for Reese. If he hit it, he could have anything he wants. So he picked, because I've always wanted to have his own barrel. Come on in.
This is Reese.
So why don't you give everybody, we got something special for you, Mark, and for everybody here.
There you go.
This guy named Goose big, probably 350
Yeah.
pounds
Big guy.
overall. He was the
Overalls.
master taster. So
Well, that's a job I could live with.
That's right. So we went out to Lynchburg and got our own barrel, and then wanted to share that barrel with you guys.
Very cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Single barrel select.
We tasted 3 different barrels. This was 334 of 2019.
It was just a tough job, but somebody had to do
It
it.
was really
Somebody had
hard.
to do it,
We
so.
were very
Thank you.
glad that we
Yeah,
just wanted
absolutely.
to.
So, Mark, thank you so much.
Thank you, I really
For everything, man. Honestly,
No, my
thank you so
Congrats
much.
on what you guys have accomplished.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Thanks for
Gerard,
listening
thank
to
you
us
so
today.
much. Peter, Georgie,
Thanks.
love you guys
Thanks,
so
guys.
much. Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you guys so much.
Really appreciate it. That's great.
All right, guys, this will be on our website, www.eonhubs.com. Thank you for joining. Talk to you guys soon.